My name is Carolyn Pruett, and I am 58 years old. For 31 years, I watched my mother's family treat a 14-acre property in Harlan County, Kentucky as their personal inheritance, land that my grandmother had quietly, legally, and irrevocably placed in my name alone on March 3rd, 1987, when I was 16 years old, without telling a single other soul. The morning it all came to a head, there were 22 people seated in the conference room of a law office in Lexington, Kentucky. My uncle had hired a real estate attorney, a business broker, and a land appraiser. He had prepared a packet, 41 pages, spiral-bound, with a cover sheet that read Pruett Family Land Legacy, Proposed Equitable Division. He had driven 3 hours to be there. He had brought his 2 sons, his daughter-in-law, my 2 cousins from my mother's side, and my mother herself, who sat at the far end of the table in a cream-colored blazer she had purchased specifically for the occasion. The land had been appraised at $1.4 million. There was a natural gas easement attached to it worth an additional $380,000 in projected royalties over 20 years. My uncle had already spoken to a developer in Middlesboro who wanted to break ground by the following spring. But what none of them knew, not my uncle, not my mother, not the attorney he had hired, was that I had been sitting with a copy of that deed for 31 years. I had read it so many times I could recite the legal description from memory. And I had spent the previous 11 days in the office of my own attorney, a woman named Patricia Owens, making absolutely certain that what my grandmother had done all those years ago was airtight, recorded, and unambiguous. Before I take you back to where this story really begins, I want to ask you to please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It costs you nothing and it means everything to a channel like this one. Drop your city and what time it is where you are in the comments. I genuinely love reading those. Every single one. Now, let me take you back to Harlan County, Kentucky, in the summer of 1974, which is where I have to start if any of the rest of this is going to make sense. I was born the second child and the only daughter of Raymond and Dottie Pruett. My father worked the mines for 11 years before a roof collapse in 1972 took 2 fingers off his left hand and convinced him that the earth was trying to tell him something. After that, he drove a delivery truck for a regional grocery distributor, leaving the house at 4:45 every morning 6 days a week, coming home smelling of diesel and cardboard and whatever he had eaten for lunch out of a paper bag in the cab of his truck. He was a quiet man. Not cold, quiet. There is a difference, and I did not always know that difference when I was young, but I know it now. My mother, Dottie, was a different kind of person entirely. She was the youngest of 4 children born to my grandparents, Earl and Loretta Combs, and she had grown up understanding herself to be the one who mattered most. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. I say it the way a doctor reads a chart. Here is what happened. Here is what it caused. My mother was the pretty one, the one who had been taken to Knoxville for a special dress when she turned 16, the one whose college fund had been started and then quietly redirected when she decided at 19 to marry my father instead of finishing her degree. She carried that redirection like a wound her whole life, and she passed the wound along to my brother, Gary, who was 3 years older than me and who my mother had decided, from the time he was about 7 years old, was the one in our family who was going to amount to something. Gary got the new clothes at the start of every school year. I got what fit. Gary got the car when he turned 17, a 1979 Ford Fairmont, used but running, because my mother said a boy needed a car to get work. When I turned 17, I got a bus pass and a lecture about responsibility. Gary's senior trip to Washington, D.C., cost $340, and my mother paid it without a word. When my class took a trip to Mammoth Cave, my junior year, the cost was $28, and my mother told me to ask my father. And my father quietly took $28 from the coffee can he kept on the shelf above the washing machine and pressed it into my hand without saying anything about it. I noticed all of it. I kept a kind of internal ledger, even then, not out of meanness, but because numbers were the only way I knew how to make sense of things that didn't make sense emotionally. I was good at math. I was good at keeping track. The person who noticed that I was good at keeping track was my grandmother, Loretta Combs, my mother's mother, which I know sounds like a contradiction, given everything I've told you about my mother. But Loretta was a woman who had watched her youngest child grow up into someone she didn't entirely recognize. And I think she felt a particular tenderness toward me as a result, toward the child in that house who was being quietly, consistently overlooked. Loretta was a small woman, 5'2", with white hair she kept pinned up and hands that smelled of lavender hand cream that she kept in a blue tin on her nightstand. She had been a bookkeeper for a hardware store in Harlan for 22 years before she retired. She understood ledgers. She understood documentation. She understood that the truth, properly recorded, was the most durable thing a person could possess. She used to sit with me at her kitchen table on Sunday afternoons while my mother and her sisters talked in the living room and my grandfather watched football in the back bedroom. She would pour us each a cup of coffee. Mine was mostly milk and sugar, which she never commented on, and she would ask me what I was thinking about. Not what happened at school. Not how I was doing. What I was thinking about. Nobody else in my life asked me that question. When I was 14, I told her I wanted to be an accountant. I had read about it in a career pamphlet at school. I liked the idea of a profession where the answer was either right or wrong, and you could prove which one. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, "Carolyn, the most powerful thing a woman can own is something that has her name on it and nobody else's." I wrote that down when I got home. I still have the piece of paper. She died in 2003. She was 81 years old. She had outlived my grandfather by 9 years. And she had spent those 9 years doing things quietly and carefully and without announcing them to anyone. One of those things was placing 14 acres of Combs family land that had belonged to her parents, land that sat at the edge of a ridge in Harlan County with a creek running along the south boundary, into my name, solely, without condition. Recorded at the Harlan County Courthouse on March 3, 1987. I was 16 years old. I did not know she had done it until the summer I turned 22, when she handed me a wooden box with brass hinges and a small brass latch and told me to open it when I needed to. She did not explain further. That was her way. I want to tell you about the wound before I tell you about the box, because the wound is what made the box matter. The summer I turned 24 was the summer my mother told me that Gary would be receiving the majority of the financial help available from the family going forward because he was starting a business and businesses required capital, and I, as a single woman with a steady job, had less need. She said this to me on July 15, 1990, at the kitchen table of my parents' house, at approximately 7 in the evening, while my father sat at the far end of the table and looked at his hands. I had, at that point, been working for 3 years as a bookkeeper for a small manufacturing firm in Lexington, where I had moved after 2 years of community college and 1 year of night courses at a state university. I was making $19,400 a year. I was living in a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat on Winchester Road. And on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, I could hear the machines running through the floor. I was taking 2 more accounting courses by correspondence because I was 12 credits away from a bachelor's degree, and I was paying for every credit myself. I had not asked my mother for money. I had not asked my family for anything since I was 18. I was not there that July evening because I needed something. I was there because it was my mother's birthday, and I had brought her a card and a bottle of her perfume. Windsong. $14.99 from the Revco on Limestone Street. And I had driven 45 minutes each way to do it. What she was telling me, I understood, was not a financial announcement. It was a declaration of priority. As she was telling me, as she had been telling me my whole life through 100 smaller gestures, that Gary was the investment and I was the overhead. I sat with that for a moment. I counted, without meaning to, the number of ceiling tiles above the kitchen table. There were 9. Then I said, "Okay,
Mom.
happy birthday." I hugged her. I drove home. I didn't cry until I was in the parking lot of my apartment building, and even then it was only for about 4 minutes. I remember that specifically. 4 minutes. And then I went inside and I opened my correspondence textbook and I studied for 2 hours because I had an exam packet due at the end of the week. That was the night I understood something that took me years to fully articulate, that the people who diminish you are counting on you to absorb the diminishment quietly and carry on as though it is normal. They are counting on your silence being permanent. They do not consider the possibility that your silence is a form of record-keeping. I want to stop here for a moment because I think some of you watching this right now know exactly what I mean when I talk about that kitchen table. You've sat at one like it. You've heard a version of that sentence, the one that tells you, in the most practical possible language, that you are not the one who matters. And you went home and you kept going, because that is what you do. If that is you, I wanted to drop the word steady in the comments. Just that one word. Because that is what you are, and I want you to know that I see it. Please also take a second to subscribe if you haven't. This channel is built for exactly this conversation. And every subscriber helps us reach more people who need to hear these stories.
Now,
back to where we were. The quiet years were not dramatic. That is the thing about rebuilding. It doesn't look like anything from the outside. It looks like a woman going to work and coming home and going to work again. I finished my bachelor's degree in accounting in 1992. I passed my CPA exam on the first attempt in 1993. I was 37 years old when I made partner at a mid-sized accounting firm in Lexington, Hargrove, Tilden and Associates, and I was the first woman to do so in the firm's 22-year history. I wore a $160 dress from a consignment shop on Euclid Avenue to the dinner they held to mark the occasion. I still have that dress. It is a deep burgundy wool crepe, and it fits me perfectly, and I have never once wished it had cost more. Along the way, I married a man named David Pruett. I kept my name, which had been my name since birth, so there was nothing to change, who taught high school history for 28 years, and who, from our first date onward, asked me what I was thinking about rather than how I was doing. I recognized that question. I knew what it meant about a person. I had one close friend, a woman named Sandra Lee, who had been my neighbor on Winchester Road back in the laundromat years, and who had watched me study at the kitchen table through the window on winter evenings, and once left a plate of biscuits outside my door with a note that said, "You look like you're working hard. Eat something." Sandra and I have been friends for 34 years. She knew about the box. The box. I need to tell you about the box. I opened it the year after my grandmother died. It was 2004, and I was sitting in my kitchen in Lexington. And I had been carrying the box in the back of my closet for 12 years without opening it because she had told me to open it when I needed to, and for 12 years I had managed not to need to. But the year after she died, I opened it. Inside were 3 things. The first was a copy of a deed. 14 acres in Harlan County, Kentucky. Recorded March 3, 1987. Grantee, Carolyn Jean Combs Pruett. Sole and separate property. The second was a letter, handwritten on pale green stationery in my grandmother's careful bookkeeper's script. It was 4 pages long. I have read it so many times the paper has gone soft at the folds. The third was a smaller envelope, sealed, with my name on the front and the words "For Patricia" written in the bottom left corner. Inside that envelope was a letter addressed to an attorney, Patricia Owens, whose name and address were printed at the top, explaining the deed, the circumstances of its creation, the family dynamics that had led my grandmother to make this decision, and her explicit wishes regarding what should happen if the land were ever contested.
My grandmother had,
apparently, consulted with Patricia Owens herself before she died. Patricia Owens had been waiting for my call for over a year. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after I read those documents. David was in the other room grading papers. The coffee I had made was cold. Outside it was raining, one of those long gray November rains that settle into the hills and don't leave for days. I thought about my grandmother at her kitchen table, pouring coffee that was mostly milk and sugar and never once making me feel small for it. I called Patricia Owens the next morning. For the next 19 years, I kept the deed in a fireproof safe in my home office, along with the certified copy that Patricia held in her files. And I did not speak of it to anyone in my family. Not because I was hiding it. It was a matter of public record at the Harlan County Courthouse. Had been for 31 years, but because no one had ever asked. The land sat. The creek ran along the south boundary. The ridge stood. And my family, as far as I could tell, had forgotten it existed. Until my Uncle Gerald did not forget. Gerald Combs was my mother's oldest brother. He was 71 years old, recently retired from a career selling commercial insurance, and he had, in the last several years, developed what I can only describe as an enthusiasm for the concept of family legacy. He had started attending genealogy conferences. He had purchased a subscription to an ancestry website. He had taken it upon himself to research the Combs family land holdings going back to the 1940s. And at some point in the late fall of 2018, he had found the deed. I know this because in December of 2018, my mother called me for the first time in 14 months.
We were not estranged.
Exactly. We spoke at holidays, exchanged cards, maintained the surface of a relationship, but we were not close. And a call in December that was not on Christmas Day was unusual. She asked how David and I were doing. She asked about my work. And then she said, Gerald has been doing some research on Grandma's property. Did you know there's some land over in Harlan County that might belong to the family? I said, I know about the land, Mom. There was a pause. Oh, she said. Well, Gerald thinks it might be worth looking into. He thinks the family should all sit down together and figure out what to do with it.
I said,
That sounds fine. Tell Gerald to have his attorney reach out to mine. Another pause. Longer this time. You have an attorney for this?
I do, I said.
She said she would pass that along. And we said goodbye. And I sat for a moment in my office chair and looked out the window at the bare trees in the backyard. Then I called Patricia Owens. What followed was 11 months of what I can only describe as a slow-motion misunderstanding on my family's part. Gerald's attorneys sent letters. Patricia responded to each one with copies of the recorded deed and a polite explanation that the property had been in my sole name since 1987 and was not subject to partition or family negotiation. Gerald's attorneys sent more letters, each one slightly more creative in its legal theory: adverse possession, constructive trust, unjust enrichment, equitable distribution of family assets. Patricia answered each one with the same patience and the same documentation. In October of 2019, Gerald called me directly. He was warm. He was reasonable. He talked about family and legacy and what Grandma Loretta would have wanted. He said he wasn't trying to take anything from me. He just thought it was worth sitting down together as a family and having a conversation about the land, about what it meant, about whether there was a way to honor everyone's connection to it. I told him I was willing to meet. What I did not tell him was that in the 11 months since my mother's December phone call, I had done the following. I had obtained a current survey of the property. I had obtained the natural gas easement documentation, which had been filed separately and which my family appeared not to have found. I had obtained a current appraisal. I had requested and received a certified copy of the original deed from the Harlan County Courthouse. I had compiled every letter Gerald's attorney had sent and Patricia's responses. I had compiled a timeline of the property's history going back to 1952. And I had placed all of it in a navy blue 3-ring binder, tabbed and indexed, with a table of contents on the first page. The binder was 2.3 inches thick. It had 29 tabbed sections. The meeting was scheduled for November 14th, 2019, at 10 o'clock in the morning, at the offices of Gerald's attorney in Lexington. Gerald had arranged the room, the attendees, and the agenda. He had sent a proposed agenda by email 3 days prior. The agenda had 5 items. Item 1 was family introductions and opening remarks. Item 5 was vote on proposed land development partnership agreement. He had already drafted a partnership agreement. I want to pause here for just a moment, because I know some of you have been in a room like the one I'm about to describe. A room where someone has arranged everything in advance: the chairs, the documents, the outcome, and invited you as though you were a participant when they had already decided you were a formality. If you've ever walked into a room like that, type "I know that room" in the comments. I read every single one, and I want you to know you are not alone in having been there. And if this story is resonating with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Hit subscribe if you haven't. It takes 2 seconds, and it means this channel can keep making stories like this one.
Now,
Back to November 14th. I arrived at the law office at 9:47 in the morning. I was wearing a charcoal gray wool blazer, a white blouse, and pearl earrings that had belonged to my grandmother. Small, round, set in plain gold. I carried the navy blue binder in a leather portfolio case that David had given me for our 20th anniversary. I had slept 8 hours the night before. I had eaten breakfast. I was not nervous. Patricia met me in the lobby. She was 63 years old, silver-haired, and she had the particular stillness of a person who has spent 40 years in rooms exactly like this one. She looked at my binder, and she nodded once. And we went upstairs together. The conference room was already full when we arrived. Gerald sat at the head of the table, which I noted. His 2 sons, Marcus and Dale, sat to his right. My mother sat to his left in her cream-colored blazer. My cousin Patrice, Gary's daughter, who I had not seen in 6 years, sat next to my mother. 2 men I did not recognize sat at the far end of the table with laptops open, the business broker and the land appraiser Gerald had hired. Gerald's attorney, a man named Howard Fitch, sat beside Gerald with his own set of documents. There were also 2 women from a commercial real estate development firm. Gerald had apparently already been in conversation with them, who sat with printed materials in front of them and the careful, pleasant expressions of people who have been paid to be present and are hoping the meeting goes smoothly. 22 people in that room, including Patricia and me. I sat down across from my mother. I placed the portfolio case on the table in front of me, and I did not open it yet. I folded my hands. I looked at Gerald, and I smiled. Gerald opened the meeting with a warmth that I recognized, the warmth of a man who believes he has already won and is being gracious about it. He talked about family. He talked about Grandma Loretta and what she had meant to all of them. He said he knew there had been some back and forth through the attorneys, and he was grateful that everyone had agreed to come together in person, because that was what family did. He said he understood that the deed to the property was in my name, and he wanted to acknowledge that right up front. He said that Grandma Loretta had clearly had her reasons, and he respected that. But he also said that the land had been in the Combs family for 3 generations, that it carried meaning for everyone in that room, and that he believed, in his heart, that Grandma Loretta would have wanted the family to benefit from it together. He slid a copy of the partnership agreement across the table to me. It was 15 pages. Under the proposed terms, I would contribute the land, valued at $1.4 million, to a family limited partnership. The partnership would then enter into a development agreement with the Middlesbrough developer. Profits would be distributed according to a formula that allocated 22% to me and divided the remaining 78% among 7 other family members, including Gerald's sons and my mother. I looked at the document for a moment. I did not pick it up. Howard Fitch began to explain the legal structure of the partnership. He was professional and thorough, and he spoke for approximately 9 minutes. When he finished, he looked at me with the expression of a man waiting for a signature. I said, "Thank you, Howard. May I have a few minutes to share some materials?" Gerald said, "Of course. Of course. That was why they were all there." I opened the portfolio case. I took out the navy blue binder. I set it on the table in front of me, and I opened it to the table of contents. I said, "I have 29 tabs here, and I'm not going to walk through all of them. But I want to share a few things that I think are relevant to this conversation." I turned to tab 1. It was a certified copy of the deed, recorded March 3rd, 1987, at the Harlan County Courthouse. I passed copies. Patricia had prepared 14 of them, around the table. I said, "This deed was recorded 32 years ago. It was a gift from my grandmother to me, made freely and without condition, when I was 16 years old. It is a matter of public record. It has been a matter of public record since the year I was a junior in high school." Gerald said, "Carolyn, we all understand that." I said, "I'm not finished, Gerald." "Thank you."
He stopped.
I turned to tab 4. It was the natural gas easement documentation. I passed copies around the table. I watched Gerald's attorney look at the top page and then look at Gerald. I said, "This is the natural gas easement attached to the property. It was filed separately from the deed and appears not to have been included in the appraisal materials that were prepared for this meeting." I looked at the appraiser at the end of the table. He was looking at the document with an expression I can only describe as professionally uncomfortable. The projected royalty value over a 20-year period, based on current rates, is $380,000. That number was not reflected in the $1.4 million figure in the partnership agreement. Howard Fitch said, "We were not aware of the easement." I said, "I know." I turned to tab 7. It was a copy of a letter, one of 11 letters Gerald's attorney had sent to Patricia over the course of the previous 11 months, each one advancing a different legal theory for why the deed should be considered a family asset rather than my sole property. I passed copies around. I said, "Over the past 11 months, I have received 11 letters from Howard's office, each one proposing a different legal basis for reconsidering the ownership of this property. Tab 7 is the first letter. Tabs 8 through 17 are the subsequent letters and Patricia's responses to each one. I looked at the two women from the development firm. They were no longer smiling. I want everyone in this room to understand that this is not a new conversation. This conversation has been ongoing since December of 2018, when my mother first called to tell me that Gerald had been doing research. My mother said, "Carolyn, I was just passing along." I said,
"Mom."
"I know. I'm not saying otherwise." I turned to tab 18. It was the letter my grandmother had written. Not the full letter. I would never share the full letter, but a single paragraph, which Patricia had advised me I could share if I chose to. I had chosen to. I read it aloud. My grandmother had written, in her careful bookkeeper's script, "I am giving this land to Carolyn because she is the one who will know what to do with it. I am not giving it to the family because the family has already decided what each person is worth. And they decided wrong about Carolyn. This is my correction. I make it freely and without reservation, and I ask that it be respected." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Gerald said, "Carolyn, I think what Grandma meant was." I said, "Gerald, she was a bookkeeper for 22 years. She said what she meant." His son Marcus said, "This is not what any of us expected today." I said, "I know." My mother said, "After everything this family has done for you." I counted 4 seconds before I responded. My hands were flat on the table. My voice did not waver. I said, "Mom, I love you." But I want to be careful right now about what the record reflects, because there are a number of people in this room who are not family members. And I think accuracy matters. I turned to tab 22. This is a summary I prepared of the financial assistance provided to Gary and to me by the family between 1974 and 1993. Gary received assistance with a vehicle in 1979, $2,400. He received full payment of a senior trip in 1981, $340. He received a business loan in 1990, $15,000, which was never repaid. I received a bus pass in 1981, which I believe cost $12 a month. I received $28 toward a school field trip in 1982 from my father's personal savings, not from the family account. I received nothing after I left home at 18. My mother's face had gone very still. I said, I am not saying this to be hurtful. I am saying it because the phrase, after everything this family has done for you, requires some examination before it can carry the weight it's being asked to carry. Howard Fitch was writing something on his legal pad. The business broker had quietly closed his laptop. The two women from the development firm were looking at the table. Gerald said, his voice rising slightly, "You are turning this into something it isn't. This was supposed to be a conversation about the future, about what we can build together." I said, I'm willing to have that conversation, but it has to start from an accurate understanding of where we are. And where we are is, I own this land. I have owned it for 32 years. My grandmother gave it to me intentionally and deliberately, and she left documentation explaining why. I closed the binder. I am not signing a partnership agreement that gives me 22% of an asset that is 100% mine.
Dale,
Gerald's younger son, said, So what? You're just going to sit on it? You're going to let it rot? I said, I'm going to do whatever I decide to do with my own property.
Dale,
That is, in fact, the definition of ownership. Gerald said, louder now. She doesn't have any connection to that land. She hasn't set foot on it in 30 years. We grew up going to that ridge every summer. That land means something to this family. I said, I know it does. And I understand that this is hard. I did not say anything else for a moment. I let the room be quiet. Gerald's face was flushed. My mother was looking at her hands. The development firm women were gathering their materials with the quiet efficiency of people who have decided they are no longer needed. Patricia spoke for the first time. She said, I think what my client is communicating is that she is not here to negotiate the ownership of the property, which is not in question. If the family has a separate conversation they would like to have about the history and meaning of the land, that is a personal matter. But as a legal matter, this meeting has reached its natural conclusion. Howard Fitch looked at Gerald. Gerald looked at my mother. My mother looked at me. I looked back at her. I did not look away. She said, very quietly, Your grandmother always did favor you. I said, Yes. She did. And I meant it as a plain statement of fact. And I think she heard it that way, because she didn't say anything else. We left the conference room at 11:42 in the morning. The meeting had lasted 1 hour and 55 minutes. I had not raised my voice once. I had not cried. I had not apologized. In the elevator, Patricia looked at me and said, You did well. I said. I had a good teacher. We went downstairs and I drove home and I called David and I told him it was done and he said, "Come home. I'll make dinner." And I drove the 40 minutes back to our house and I sat in the kitchen while he cooked and I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired and clean. The way you feel after you have set something heavy down that you have been carrying for a very long time. What happened after that? I did not orchestrate, and I did not pursue. Gerald's development deal with the Middlesbrough company fell through within 3 months. I later learned, through Patricia, that when the developers team did their own title search and discovered the 11 months of legal correspondence, all of it now part of the property's record, they decided the title history was too complicated to proceed with. Gerald had apparently represented to them that the ownership situation was nearly resolved. It was not. Howard Fitch, Gerald's attorney, filed a motion in early 2020 attempting to establish a constructive trust over the property. Patricia answered it. The motion was denied in April of 2020. The judge's order, which Patricia sent me a copy of, was 3 pages long and cited the 1987 deed, the recorded documentation, and my grandmother's letter. It was, in the judge's language, unambiguous. Gerald stopped calling after that. His sons stopped calling. The development firm women, I assume, moved on to other projects. My mother called me in the spring of 2021. It was March, and the trees were just starting to come back. And I was sitting on our back porch with a cup of coffee when my phone rang. She said she had been thinking. She said she knew that things had not gone the way Gerald had hoped. She said she wanted me to know that she understood.
Now.
Why Grandma Loretta had done what she had done. She did not say she was sorry. I did not expect her to. But she said she understood. And from my mother, in the language my mother speaks, that was as close as she could get. I said, "I know you did the best you could, Mom." And I meant that too. Not as a comfort to her, as a true thing. She had done the best she could with the understanding she had. Her best had not been enough. For me. For a long time. But it was what it was. And she was 80 years old. And I was not going to spend whatever time we had left in a courtroom of my own making. We talked for 40 minutes that afternoon. About nothing important. About the spring. About Gary's youngest grandchild, who had just started walking. About a recipe she had made from a magazine, a lemon cake that hadn't set properly, and whether it was the altitude or the oven. I didn't forgive her for the kitchen table in 1990. I don't think forgiveness works that way, like a switch you flip and the debt is cleared. I think forgiveness is more like a door you stop walking past and rattling the handle of. You just stop. You go do something else. You go sit on your porch and drink your coffee and watch the trees come back. My cousin Gary, not my brother Gary, but Gerald's son Gary, the older one, sent me a letter in the fall of 2022. Handwritten, 2 pages. He said he had been embarrassed by the meeting. He said he had gone along with his father's plan because he hadn't known the full history, and that after reading the materials I had shared in that conference room, he had gone home and thought about it for a long time. He said his grandmother had been a remarkable woman and he was sorry that the family had not treated me the way she had tried to. I wrote him back.
It was a short letter.
I told him I appreciated him saying so. The land is still mine. I have not developed it, I have not sold it. Last spring, David and I drove down to Harlan County on a Saturday in April, and we walked the property for the first time in many years. The creek along the south boundary was running clear and fast. The ridge was covered in redbuds, that particular pink that only happens for about 10 days in April in the Kentucky hills. And it was so bright against the gray of the bare trees around it that it almost hurt to look at. I stood at the edge of the ridge, and I thought about my grandmother at her kitchen table, pouring coffee and asking me what I was thinking about. I was thinking about how she had known. She had watched her family, for decades, watched the way love got distributed unevenly, watched the way the quiet ones got passed over, watched the way the records never reflected the reality. And she had done the one thing in her power to do. She had put something in my name. Something solid. Something recorded. Something that would still be standing when everything else had shifted. She had given me the most powerful thing a woman can own. And I had known what to do with it. If you are watching this and you recognize yourself in any part of the story, if you have sat at that kitchen table, if you have driven home from a meeting where someone tried to take what was yours, if you have spent years being the steady one while someone else got the car and the party and the investment,
I want you to know something.
Your patience was not weakness. Your silence was not surrender. The record you kept in your head, the ledger you maintained without anyone asking you to, the way you kept going when going was the only option, that was not nothing. That was everything. Your grandmother may not have left you 14 acres. But somebody saw you. Somebody always sees the steady one, even when it doesn't feel that way. And the truth, properly kept, has a way of outlasting every partnership agreement that was ever drafted without your name at the top. Thank you for spending this time with me today. If this story meant something to you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment and tell me what you're thinking about, not how you're doing, what you're thinking about. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.